Next on Garden Line, learn about pruning flowering shrubs.
And then once they're finished flowering, we can start our pruning.
Funding for Garden Line is provided in part by your membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. And by Swiftel Communications.
Hello and welcome to Garden Line. I'm Stephen Monk. Tonight on our show, spring is a good time to trim those flowering shrubs in your yard. Extension Forestry Specialist John Ball will teach us how to remove old growth while ensuring there will be a flower blossom this season. And as always, our panel of lawn and garden experts will answer your questions, so get ready to call in. Our panelists are here with the most up-to-date information about gardening, lawn care, insects, trees, and a host of other lawn and garden related concerns. Joining me in the studio to answer your questions is John Kiekefer, Brookings County Extension Educator, David Graper, SDSU Horticulture Department Head and Extension Horticulturalist, Larry Osborne, Extension Plant Pathologist, and Mike Mecknane, Extension Weed Specialist. You can start calling now. The phone number for you to call in your lawn and garden questions is 1-866-595-SDSU. Again, that is 1-866-595-7378. Helping to answer the phones tonight are the folks from the SDSU Plant Science Graduate Student Association. And remember, when you call in your questions, please provide your phone volunteers with as much information as possible about your garden problem. Be ready to provide a description of the problem, when the problem first appeared, whether it's affecting any other surrounding plants, and moisture and or soil conditions that exist around the problem that you're noticing. First off, we'll go around the table to hear from our panel what is currently happening, starting with John Kiekefer. John, what do you have for us tonight?
Well, we've got kind of a neat new pest, at least in my opinion. It's neat and it's something that most people haven't seen too much. We've got a black vine weevil. The name on this is Odeorhynchus sulcatus. And I've gotten a number of these in during the winter and still through this spring. Got a close-up here of a headshot of one of these things. And if we go to the next image, these are fairly large weevils, and they look a lot like those strawberry root weevils that people will find in their homes. Those strawberry root weevils are in that same genus, that Odeorhynchus genus. And a couple of them that have come in, people have brought them in and said, I think this is a strawberry root weevil that just had a lot of good things to eat. And really that's not the case at all. It's a different species. These are ones that haven't been in South Dakota much. Up until about a year ago, maybe we started seeing a few more of them. And despite the name black vine weevil for their common name, they feed on a variety of different plants. Probably their most common host here would be the yews that are grown as landscape and ornamental shrubs around homes.
Okay. Would they be considered a pest you need to control?
If you had large enough numbers, you may want to do some control on them. It'd be like the strawberry root weevil. The larvae feed on the roots of that plant, and then the adults come in. And really most of the questions that I've gotten have been from people wanting to control them in the home when they get a few of them moving around the home inside.
Okay. Thanks, John. David, what do you have for us?
Well, I was out at McCrory yesterday taking a few pictures to see what's happening out there. We've got a garden tour coming up here the first part of next month. But people are asking what's blooming, what's happening out at McCrory Garden. So I've got a few images to share with you of some of the things that are happening out there right now. This first one is a really cool little spring flowering bulb that some people may not be familiar with. It's called Chionodoxa. It's only about 6 or 7 inches tall, but it has these wonderful sky blue and white flowers. It comes out pretty early in the spring. It's sometimes called Glory of the Snow. So it's one that we've had plenty of snow yet this spring, so this certainly has been blooming even though we've had some of the snow out there. But it's a nice little bulb. This plant has been in the ground for now about 3 years or so, so it starts to make a nice little clump of plants after a few years. Really pretty little plant to put on the edge of a bed or somewhere up close where you can get a good look at it. This next image is another one of my favorite plants. And this has become very popular in a lot of sites right now. This is kind of a new spring showstopper plant for a shady garden. This is a Helleborus, also called a Lenten rose. And here's a picture of a white one. I've got some pictures of some other colors here in a moment. But this is a perennial plant, like the Chianodoxa, but this one is a plant that you put in the ground. You could plant them now. And it's going to be a plant that increases in size over time. And right now this plant is probably about 10 to 12 inches tall or so. And it has these wonderful little nodding flowers. And they come in a whole variety of colors, and the plant breeders have been going crazy with these things in recent years. I've got 5 new varieties I'm going to plant out in the garden soon, and the colors in some of these flowers are just fantastic. So here's the white one. I think the next image is of a pink one, and we've got one more image of some red ones, which are all in bloom at McCrory Gardens right now, and again, this is the Lenten rose or Helleborus. Got another image of something I spotted out at the gardens, and this is just a pussy willow, but it's after those little catkins have started to flower out a little bit, and there were some flower flies and some other insects buzzing around those. But this plant has put on a great show for us this spring. And when I walked by it yesterday, I saw these things buzzing around there. It was just some flower flies, but the salix and a lot of the other early flowering trees are going to start budding out here as soon as the weather warms up a little bit. This next image is one that you might be seeing out in your yard someplace. This is vole damage. We had a lot of vole damage out at McCrory this year. Essentially, it's a field mouse that goes out and tunnels beneath the snow, kind of right through the turf layer, and they essentially just mow off the grass and mow and get down into the thatch layer even a little bit, and just start chewing that stuff up and make little nests and tunnels. So you'll see that out in your yard. Just take a rake over it in the spring, and you can get rid of that excess material that they've kind of accumulated there. And your grass should grow back okay. If not, you can just sprinkle a little grass in there, try to fill in those spots. Next image is another one of my favorite things to see at McCrory these days, and that's the new Education and Visitor Center, which is under construction. This is a view looking from looking toward the north from the south. If you come out to McCrory Gardens, you get to see how the construction is going on this building. It's about a 9,300 square foot building. We were talking about this last year. It started coming out of the ground last fall and has been really making some good progress. We have one more image of this looking from the other direction, I believe. Maybe not. But the building is, there we go. There's the other side of the building. You can see we've still got some work to do on some of the roof and so forth, but they're busy working on that pretty hard. And the last image I have for you is one of my favorite flowers, and hopefully one that all of you will enjoy too. That's the pasque flower, Pulsatilla patens, which is just coming into bloom at McCrory Gardens. Those of you that are further out West River, these have probably been in bloom for a week or two already, but these are just starting to pop out of the ground and get some color on them right now. And lastly, I want to mention to you that we're going to be doing a spring garden walk on May 6th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This is in commemoration of National Public Gardens Day, which is a relatively new event, but it's an event that's being held at botanic gardens and public gardens all over the country. And this is the first year that we're going to try to do something to commemorate that day at McCrory Gardens with the spring garden walk. So come on out, just meet us in the front parking lot. We'll take you around the gardens and see what's happening and what's growing and answer your questions that you might have.
Good, very good. So as far as the tour, they just need to show up. They don't have to pre-register or anything?
Just show up, and hopefully the weather will be nice, and we'll get a nice chance to walk around and look at a lot of plants and answer folks' questions that they might have.
How late will that run, Dave?
As late as it goes.
As long as it has sunlight.
But we'll try to start at 2 o'clock, and so I'm guessing 2 or 3 hours or so we should be done.
All right, good. Thank you very much. Larry, what do you have for us tonight?
Well, good to be back from a long, cold winter, and it's still long and cold here in Brookings. It's rare that we get to talk about apple scab here in Brookings at the beginning of garden line season and actually have it be an appropriate time to talk about it. I have with me a couple of specimens here just from some species in the apple family, the rose family. These plants are just in the right condition, and hopefully we can see those on the camera. These are in just the right condition to be infected by the apple scab fungus, Venturia aniqualis. This one here is, you see the buds are broken and the petals are just starting to come out. We might call this silver tip or something like that. But if you read in the management guides that even just before this condition, maybe something more like what we see here, the buds are swollen and beginning to enlarge and going to emerge before too long. This is the perfect time to get those early season fungicides on if you have a susceptible plant to apple scab, and that could be a lot of our apples or crabs. So on the visuals, we have show you what apple scab looks like later in the season. On a susceptible crab apple, for example, we could lose almost all of our leaves. It's not terribly damaging to that tree in one season or two, but after 3 or 4 or 5 years of that tree is going to start to decline. Of course, it makes the apples look very unappetizing, and then of course the yellow leaves are just not going to provide the food to fill out good ripe red apples. So we try and manage apple scab. Again, it's a fungal disease, but it's one we try and manage through resistance. We plant resistant species or resistant varieties, and there's some listed there: Freedom, Harrelson, Honeycrisp, Sweet 16. There's others. Check with your nursery center. They'll talk to you about the resistance in those different species. But this disease goes not only to the apple tree, but as I mentioned, crab apples, pears, and some other related plants. But wet weather like we're having here in Brookings and around the state is just optimal for infection. So typically at the end of April we'd be well beyond infection time, but right now for those important plants or those that are very productive for you, might want to get out a fungicide spray. I want to talk to you just a minute about the difference between a multi-purpose spray and a fungicide spray. What you see on the left is a fruit tree spray that's going to have a couple of different insecticide components in addition to the fungicide. The product on the right, that's Captan. Captan is the fungicide that's in the fruit tree spray, but each of those pints of product will spray about 14 or 15 gallons they'll mix up about 14 or 15 gallons. But if you do that, you're going to get about a third or a fourth the amount of fungicide out of that fruit tree spray that you would out of the Captan product. And all those insecticides at this time of year are pretty much wasted. I mean, we might be stepping out of my bounds a little bit there, but to say that we don't have too many insect problems till after petal fall is probably accurate. To get a little more information about managing this disease, we have a couple of nice publications. Fact Sheet 939, very nice colorful circular on apple scab, and then Fact Sheet 934, which talks about just general management of all plant diseases in the home garden, gives you a chemical guide, gives you a little bit of an idea of how to appropriately use those products, including some of the organics. So that's apple scab. We're right on time this year. This is an unusual thing for the start of the garden line season.
I was going to say, usually we answer that after the symptoms have already shown up and it's too late for control, so it's good to get on that. But the fungicide just itself would be the product to use now more so than the multi-purpose.
Right. Just save that insecticide for the codling moth and those other things later on.
Would we be out of line, John, to mention as far as avoiding an insecticide up till the petals have fallen off?
That's absolutely a key point there. You want to make sure that you're not putting an insecticide on when you need those pollinators there, because if you're going to eliminate your pollinators, you won't get the fruit set that you're going for anyway.
Okay, very good. Mike, what do you have for us in the weed area?
Well, yeah, just like Larry, I'm kind of sitting here waiting for my weeds to start growing as well. But some of the perennial weeds are popping, and some of the biennials or the winter annual weeds are starting to pop up. And so now might be a good time to go after some of those. Especially in your flower garden before your flowers get taken off and that sort of thing. Your asparagus patch. Now's a good time to start cleaning some of those things up before they start growing. And just a few I want to mention. One prickly one that we're seeing now, you might be seeing this bull thistle or some of the other biennial thistles. So it's just a biennial. It's not that creeping root Canada thistle type weed. So this one you could just stick a screwdriver in there and pop that out of the ground and get rid of it that way, or spot treat, that type of thing. So bull thistles, go clean those out of your flower beds now. The other one I want to mention, and this is one that normally we can't talk about because usually this is past, this is mature by now, but you might have time to control burr buttercup yet. This is more of a central South Dakota, western South Dakota weed. Not a big weed, very small, but very nasty. That burr is just wicked. It won't go away once it's produced. So once that burr is there, you could spray all you want, but that burr is going to stay there. And so very annoying weed, but it might just be starting to produce burrs now, so you might be able to control it. We worked with Bob Fanning out in Lyman County to try to find some things to control this, and it turns out 2,4-D works just as good as anything else. It can be applied in late fall or early spring, but it has to be done before that burr is produced. Okay. So burr buttercup, very annoying.
Yeah, I suppose in barefoot, if you step on that, you'll certainly notice that.
Oh yeah, you'll notice it. Yeah. When I was taking pictures of that one, I knelt down and on the patch, and boy, I tell you, my knee, it was not good. Yeah, they're wicked. They don't look like much, but they're wicked.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike.
Yep.
So now, before we get into our questions, we'd like to hear from Dennis Toddy, our Extension State climatologist, about our cool spring, the 4-inch soil temperatures that are out there, and what is safe to plant at this time of the year. So Dennis, take it away.
This is Dennis Toddy with this week's Garden Line Climate Minute. Today we're going to be talking about soil temperatures across the state. The map you see in front of you shows 4-inch average soil temperatures averaged across the day and over several days over the last week across the state. You can see temperatures reaching into mainly the low 40s to mid 40s across the state. This puts us in a good situation for people wanting to plant cooler season crops like peas or lettuces or something along that line. Although I would caution you at this point about planting any of the hardier things that require a little bit warmer temperatures, or to also watch out for recurrence of cooler temperatures, since we still seem to be in a bit of a cold pattern, and the longer range outlooks still talk about some periods of cool temperatures. These will occur during the spring. More soil temperature information, other outlook information you can find across the state is available at our website at climate.sdstate.edu.
All right, so thank you, Dennis, for that information. So now we'll get into the questions that we have coming in already, gentlemen. So first one, Mike, I'm going to hit you with that one. From Miller, can you use prune herbicide on asparagus?
Yeah, and you'd want to use that before those spears emerge, but you don't want to be too early with some of those herbicides. They're mainly for annual grasses and some annual broadleaf weeds, and so we're maybe a week or so away from having some of those emerge. So we got a little bit of time, so you don't want to jump the gun too much, but sure, before the spears emerge, you could use it, and always follow the label and make sure you're using the recommended rates.
Kind of a follow-up question to that, or folks that have perennial grass problems in asparagus.
Yeah, see, and that seems like when I think of asparagus, I think of perennial grasses, and prune's really not going to do anything to those perennial grasses, unfortunately. And so, it's mainly for foxtails and things like that. So for the perennial grasses, you're going to be hand weeding, mulching, things like that. There's really no good way to control those perennial grasses in the asparagus.
Okay. Dave from Volga, is it possible to trim tomato plants? And if so, what is the procedure and is it recommended? Does trimming tomato plants really do any good?
Well, the idea is that you're going to remove some of the excess little shoots that are going to develop along the stem, or suckers is what some people call them. I'm not convinced it really does a whole lot of good. I've never pruned my tomatoes or taken out those suckers. The idea is that you want to just take out the tips of those, leave the main shoots grow out, but when you get the secondary little branches that develop, to pinch those out and just leave like 2 or 3 leaves behind, so that you still have some vegetation there to help manufacture food and get more tomatoes, but you can hopefully get bigger tomatoes. In my experience, where I haven't pruned them, I don't think it's really a big issue. It might help open up the plant and get better air circulation, maybe reduce some of the disease issues, but I think for most varieties, it's not really that critical to do it. I think you might, in some cases, if you do it improperly, do more harm than good.
How about some of these folks that have started tomatoes and they're getting too leggy? They don't want to get them outside
yet. I don't think they want to prune them back. Okay. The easiest thing to do with a leggy tomato is just to plant it deeper. You can plant the tomato actually on its side and just have the stem kind of curl out the end so that you get maybe 2 or 3 inches of stem below the ground, and that stem will root and give you more roots, and some people like doing that. They like getting bigger tomatoes and doing that to get a better, more established plant later on. But I wouldn't prune them until you start seeing that plants really starting to branch out and bush out, and you start to see those secondary shoots developing along the stems.
Okay. From Webster, John, webworms. Spray trees and bushes to remove the webworms?
Well, I'm assuming they're talking the tent caterpillar types. You see the egg masses out there yet at this time. Those egg masses aren't hatched yet. They have that kind of glassy looking bead almost that surrounds an entire twig. It's a good time to get out there and try to do some control if you're concerned about them, if you can spot those egg masses out there. Simplest way to remove them is simply just cut them off and destroy them. Don't let them hatch at all. As far as insecticides, a little early for that. We'd actually want to catch them just as they're hatching to get best control with an insecticide product, but definitely could do some hand control on them at this time.
Mm-hmm. I've had pretty good luck. If you catch them just right, you start to see the web showing up, put a pair of gloves on and just physically take care of them that way.
Yeah, physical control really for them is about as effective as anything.
Okay. Back to you, Dave. Giant bearded iris. It's getting too close, too big to the house. Can they transplant it now or wait till they have flowered or after flowering?
Generally for the iris, it's best to wait until after they've flowered. We usually say like the month of July is probably the ideal time. But iris are one of those plants that you can just about do anything to them and the darn things are going to still survive and grow. So if they're in a spot where you have to move them because you're going to do some construction or you're going to paint the house or something like that, they're going to get damaged, carefully dig them out and try to keep as much soil on those roots at this time of year as possible, and you can move them. But it's much better if you can wait until July, then you can divide them out, reestablish them in a new location. That's also a good time to, now's a good time to think about cleaning up that weed patch that might be where those are going to go, so that you can plant them into a clean site that doesn't have any perennial weeds growing in it. And it's also a way to, if you got a really weedy patch, dividing them and transplanting is a good way to deal with those weeds issues too.
Mm-hmm. They're from Hosmer. I don't know if that makes any difference in all of it. Time of year. Okay. Rapid City, and Dave and perhaps Mike on this one. Lilac bushes, they're 10 years old, but they would like to know how to get rid of them.
Well, lilacs kind of fall into that same category as the iris. You can do just about anything to them, and they're going to probably still come back. So I'll let Mike give you some suggestions on an herbicide route, but probably the easiest thing to do is to try to just cut those things down as close to the ground as you can, and then just keep after them and keep cutting them back. You might want to even come in with a stump grinder or something and try to grind out the base of those. If they're 10 years old, they aren't going to be really big, but they can still get pretty well-established root system. And you need to get some of that shoot tissue out of there to prevent them from growing back.
Yeah, right. I think that's probably going to be the best approach, probably the most practical approach. Certainly going to have to cut them out and remove it. If you do want to let it grow and then put Roundup on the regrowth, the fresh regrowth, let it grow a foot or so and then Roundup. But otherwise, yeah, you're probably going to have to remove the stump anyway, and so just grinding it out and or removing it to the best you can is going to be the best approach.
Okay. Here we go. Austrian pines this year. They want to know why they're all looking so brown or the needles look as if they're dying.
Well, I think if you look around much of South Dakota, you're going to find that a lot of the evergreens are not quite so green this time of year. We had that warm spell that came in February or so when the temperatures warmed up pretty good. We had a fair bit of wind, as we often do when the temperatures warm up like that. The ground was still frozen, the roots were still frozen, so those warm, relatively warm winds essentially sucked moisture out of those needles and desiccated them, and that water couldn't be replaced from the root system because the ground was still frozen. So what we're seeing essentially is winter burn or winter desiccation or winter browning, whatever you want to call it. The key to think about it is to look at the buds and the tips of those branches and see if those buds still look like they're green. They probably aren't expanding much yet, but take a look at some of those buds. They should look like they're still fairly fleshy. You can even break a few of them apart and see if they're still green and tender inside. And if they are, they're going to put on some fresh new growth here in a few weeks, and that's going to help to cover up some of that brown. But those brown needles, unfortunately, are going to probably be there for a while. We'll see some of them fall off this fall, and some might fall off during the course of the season if they're completely dead. But unfortunately, we just got some brown evergreens out there, and that's what we're going to have to deal with for a while.
Don't go pruning any branches off until you really know for sure if new growth is coming out or not. Okay.
Give them some time yet. Chances are good that those buds are still alive. The buds usually don't get damaged unless it's a real severe situation, but those needles often turn around. I've got some Scotch pine in my yard that I don't think there's hardly any green on them at all, but I'm hoping that they're going to still green out and give us some new growth.
Okay. These, I'm going to read both of these. They're both from Sioux Falls. And they relate to what you talked about earlier, Dave, and you did a good job of talking about how to take care of it once you notice the symptoms. But a follow-up question here as deals with voles. Is there anything that we should or can do to help keep them out or out of the yards to start with? Then the other one here was the backyard has dead spots. Looks like something is living under the snow. Ground feels spongy. Rest of the lawn looks okay and green, other than those dead spots. And I think they're two probably similar related symptoms.
I think they might be the same thing if they're getting kind of a squishy, mushy feeling to the grass. Again, just take your hand or take a rake and just kind of pull that material apart. You'll probably notice that it's just a lot of cut grass clippings and old dead clippings that the voles have kind of piled together in the course of their feeding. They feed down in the crowns of the plants, and they usually don't end up killing the grass completely. Usually there's enough crown tissue there that the plants will regrow. But the easiest thing to do is just to rake that area out and sprinkle some fresh grass seed down in there. And now is a great time to be doing that when we've got these moist conditions. That grass seed will get in there and start germinating as soon as the soil warms up a little bit more. As far as preventing them from coming out, that's really pretty difficult to do. If you can get rid of some of the other places that the voles might be hiding during the course of the growing season, you know, wood piles and other debris areas where they might be living during the summertime, they move out from those areas into that grass to feed during the wintertime underneath the snow. So clean up some of those areas around there. That might help reduce them. But like I say, the good news is generally the damage is not real severe and not real permanent.
Okay. Chelsea, and I think we talked about this a little bit, John, tent caterpillars. But they are out. I assume the question's coming in that they would already be out then?
I would be very surprised to find any out. They're herbivores. They're going to feed on those leaves that are out, and if there are no leaves out on the trees, they don't have anything to eat. Once they hatch from those eggs, they're like any young animal. They've got to eat fairly quickly. They don't have a lot of time to wait around. And so any of those that have hatched at this point, if you don't have leaves fully leafed out, they're going to be goners anyway. What you're probably seeing is some webs yet from last year that are still on there. They don't disappear all the time very quickly, and if that's the case, you could just remove those tents or those.
I know a number of times we get calls and from the webs, and they notice, and basically it was waste that was in the webs, but they think that's eggs for caterpillars coming up. This particular one, it is in a shelter belt, and they talk about the trees are too large to spray effectively throughout the shelter belt. Okay. In a shelter belt situation, anything different or unique there that you'd like to recommend, or?
Well, yeah, you know, honestly, with a lot of these, they're a little bit unsightly, but as far as the actual damage that they're going to do to the trees, it's pretty rare that they'll do any significant damage to them. It's just a matter of people don't like seeing those webs up there. So in a shelter belt type setting, I would say just leave them alone and don't worry too much about them up there.
Okay. Let's see here. How many, Dave, this is for you. And this comes from, we don't know. Not much information other than, how many times can you plant potatoes without having to buy new potato seed?
That's a good question, and the best answer probably is just once. You can do it more times than that, but why wouldn't they want to plant the same seed over and over again?
Right. Well, they've got virus problems and bacterial problems and all kinds of things that just aren't going to be healthy about that. And we're going to anything we accumulate during the year in terms of insect transmitted viruses right back into the soil with those seed potatoes.
But is there anything you could do, like spray, you know, a weak solution of Clorox or something like that?
Yeah, no, not on the viruses, not any of the systemic viruses. No, there's not a really good treatment for that.
So when we're at the store, they talk about certified seed.
Right.
And certified seed means what?
Well, particularly with potatoes, those have been through a rigorous evaluation in the field during the growing season that seed field is growing. Those plants have been inspected for viruses and other problems. The potatoes, after they're brought out and to become seed pieces, then they're inspected again. So those seed potato certification is a very rigorous process, like for any of our seeds, but they're certified to be free of a lot of different diseases. Not all diseases, of course, but many of the ones that can be transmitted year to year. So buying new seed pieces every year in terms of your potato crop is a very smart thing to do. Simply too many viruses like tobacco mosaic virus and some other things that are just so easily transmitted mechanically and in other insects. It's too easy to get those things into the plant, and they're systemic, and they'll be carried over from year to year.
All right, good. From Colton, Dave, holly is the topic. They'd like to plant some holly as a windbreak and distinguish between male and female. What is recommended as far as a variety? Or would you recommend holly?
Well, I wouldn't recommend holly at all, really. There are, and I can't think of the name of the varieties, it's two little short names that are male and female, the cultivar names. And I've tried growing them at McCrory, but I'm not sure if they overwinter killed or if the rabbits chewed them off or what. But check with some of your local nursery folks that are out there. I wouldn't try to go to one of the big box stores. I'd go to one of your local nurserymen and ask them if they have anything that they might carry. But holly is really iffy in this part of the world. They aren't necessarily hardy enough for us, and they don't deal with our alkaline soils very well. So if you want to try a couple in your yard, get a male and a female plants and try them in your yard and see if you can get them to grow. Most of the hollies that we would grow here are deciduous as opposed to the ones that you might see, thinking of the classic holly, evergreens and so forth. They aren't going to do it here at all. So you might see them in some of the local big box stores. And if you want to buy one and get it replaced the following year because it's dead, that's up to you. But most of the hollies around here just aren't going to be a good choice, and certainly not as a shelter belt plant.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to take a break from the questions for a little bit, and we're going to go to online location with the Extension Forestry Specialist John Ball. When is the best time to prune a flowering shrub? John will talk about that. John also tells us what not to trim so you can still have flowering blossoms this season.
Well, spring's the time for pruning, and one of the things we need to take care of are shrubbery. In fact, shrubs do better with annual pruning. The trick is when. For our spring flowering shrubs such as forsythias, plants that are coming in bloom during April, we want to delay our pruning until after they flower. All the flowers that you see forming here formed on last year's wood. So if we went out and pruned the forsythias or lilacs now, we're not going to see flowers this year. You'll also notice that all the flowers are forming on wood that's only 1 year old. So we want to maximize the amount of young wood on our shrubs to really get that flowering we really want to see. So to do that, we're going to wait until our plants are through blooming. Anything that blooms before lilacs or lilacs, wait till after they flower, and then once they're finished flowering, we can start our pruning. To properly prune these, we want to make our cuts down in the interior here. I'm not going to make my cuts out here, but instead reach in with a good pair of loppers and cut way down here, about 2 to 3 inches above the ground, make the cuts and pull the branches out. Now if we do that and reach in there and remove about 1/3 of these canes, 2 to 3 inches from the ground, what we're going to do is we're going to renew that plant. Every year take out about 1/3 of it after it flowers, and in 3 years you've completely renewed it, meaning you do not have any wood on your plant that's more than 3 years old. If you do that every year, you're going to find you have a spring flowering shrub that's a showcase every single year.
All right, well, we want to thank John for that information on pruning our shrubs. Dave, would this also be a good time as far as some of our trees?
Well, we're kind of coming to the end of the pruning season for most of our trees.
Okay.
Typically by now those buds are starting to swell, and the plants are putting their energy into doing that, breaking those buds and getting some leaves out. Well, ideally you'd be done pruning by now, although I think there's probably a lot of folks like me that hasn't been out there doing a whole lot of pruning yet. For one thing, I didn't want to wear my hip boots out into my apple orchard and do the pruning, but I'm going to try to get out there as soon as I can. But once you start going into that bud break process and the leaves start coming out, you really should be doing a lot of pruning then. And also for some trees like say oaks and elms, you can encourage some disease and insect problems by pruning too late in the season. So best to try to get that done as quickly as you can.
All right, on the tail end of that window.
Right.
Okay. Well, during the week we do have some questions that come in via email, and this one we have on this particular email comes to us from Beersford, and it is on red twig dogwood, and I believe we have some graphics to talk about that. I trimmed my red twig dogwood bushes back 2 years ago. Now it seems like the new growth grows outward and lays on the ground. What do I need to do to get it to get nice upright growth again? Did I trim it too closely or too severely? Any thoughts or ideas on this?
Well, I think they were kind of trying to do what John was showing us earlier, although it looks like they maybe went a step further here and did what we would call a rejuvenation pruning, where they've cut everything off. Dogwood, kind of like the forsythia, gives us its best display on that newest wood. So what it looks like they've done here is they've cut maybe a little bit on the short side, but it's not uncommon for a dogwood, which is a pretty vigorous plant, to just put out a proliferation of shoots after it's been pruned. So what I'd suggest here to try to resolve this issue is you've got a few shoots that are growing upright, let those alone and just go ahead and snip those other ones back close to the base of the plant there to get rid of some of those more horizontal looking shoots. And hopefully you'll generate some additional shoots from the base of that plant that are going to be more upright. But sometimes when you do a severe pruning like that, you're going to get that just proliferation of shoots, and some of those close to the ground are going to tend to kind of be down there, and they will root in and actually give you a bigger plant sometimes, but you may not want that.
Okay, good. A couple others that came in. Rapid City, can I plant rhubarb in a raised bed and leave it there over the winter? Do they need mulch?
Well, rhubarb is probably one of our toughest hardy perennial plants. They're often rated as hardy to zone 2. You have to keep in mind zone 2 probably has a good 4 feet of snow covering it all winter long too, in which we don't often have that. The problem with a raised bed, if it's a relatively small raised bed, is that ground can get really cold if it's up above the regular soil line. So use a bigger raised bed if you can, and to probably be safe, I would say after the ground starts to freeze this fall, throw a good 6-8 inches of mulch or so over the top of that, and that should get you through the winter okay, as long as it's not just a pot sitting on top of the soil, but it's a good sized plant. Get some mulch on there to try to maintain that soil heat as much as you can around that plant. But rhubarb, if you're going to try it with any kind of a perennial plant, rhubarb probably is a good one to try it with.
All right. I moved into a new home a couple of years ago here, John, and they have a very nice but mature looking apple tree. I've noticed each year that the apples have worms in them. Can you tell me what I can do to get rid of them and make the apples edible to humans? The worms seem to be having no problem with that.
The worms are doing just great, aren't they? Yeah. Well, and chances are what they're dealing with here are apple maggots. These are the worms are the larvae of flies. These are our common pests in apples in this part of the world. We do see some codling moths as well, which would be caterpillars of a moth. But typically what we're going to see most of are going to be those apple maggots. This is one of those things that we talked a little bit about earlier, where you don't want to be spraying an insecticide yet at this time of year. You want to wait until flowers have dropped the petals and bloom is completely past. And really what we look at is starting about the 1st of July for that application of an insecticide. And then you'd want to repeat that every 10 days to 2 weeks, or if you get a heavy rain, it starts to wash that off, you're going to have to go in and repeat that as well. Other things that you can do to try to clean some of that up if you don't want to use as much insecticide on those trees, make sure you get those windfall apples picked up as quickly as possible, at least every couple of days. And then there are some traps out there that can be used as well, some that look like a red apple that will attract the adults. You coat them with a sticky substance and they attract the flies and they get stuck on those red apples. Or just simply even using what are called apple bags that are put around the apples and prevent those flies from getting to those developing apples on them.
What about the home brew concoctions in the milk jugs?
The home brew concoctions are like a lot of the others. I've heard of some of these for yellow jackets as well and for other insects like that. The idea is that you provide something that's more attractive to them than what they're intending to go find. If you can come up with something that'll pull them more reliably than those apples and it's working for you, absolutely go for it. But honestly, chances are they're going to be more attracted to those red apples that are out there, those fake red apples that you can hang in those trees, than they would be to any home brew.
Okay. Sioux Falls, Dave, and maybe Larry as well. I have some questions concerning my single grapevine that I planted approximately 10 years ago. It's a Concord plant that was cultivated from SDSUs, what they indicate here. 3 years ago, it produced 5 gallons of grapes. The past 2 years, it's hardly had any bunches of grapes. The foliage was great with no signs of problems. When does the fruit set fruit? When does the plant set fruit? Could the no plant be caused perhaps from weed spray? Any suggestions?
Well, grapes are a little bit slow to leaf out in the spring. It takes a little bit longer to get leafed out. But soon after they start leafing out, the flower buds will be there too. And the grapes essentially sit on shortly after you see those flower buds. So watch for the little flower clusters to emerge on the plants. You should see hopefully some bee activity out there, but that's when the fruit are going to be set on the plant, when pollination occurs and the fruit set will begin. I think some people had some problems with grape production last year, where I think we had some late frosts that could have caused some damage to some of those flowers last year. That may have been why you didn't have good pollination. Or you could have some other reasons that you just didn't get a good pollination of those flowers at the time that they were out there. But It happens pretty early in the spring, so kind of keep an eye out for it. It's probably several weeks away yet at this point, but that's when the fruit set starts. As far as herbicides, they can be very sensitive to some of the herbicides out there, Larry.
You bet. Well, and the other thing, I guess, a question I would have about grapes is I think if you don't properly prune those, they can tend to become couch potatoes and just put out leaves and no fruit. Is that correct?
Well, that's true. You can get to the point where, especially an old grape, if they've never done any pruning to it, you should still get grapes, but the grapes are going to be very small. You'll have lots of small clusters as opposed to fewer larger clusters. So some good, vigorous pruning is going to help give you some bigger clusters of fruit and reduce some of the disease problems too out there. Make it easier to pick too.
Right.
Yep. Well, I heard when you think you're done pruning grapes, go back and take out half of what's left. So
that's about right.
Yeah.
Usually, if you go to a commercial vineyard and look at how their grapes are in the spring after they've been pruned, you're going to be pretty shocked when you think about how much material they've taken out. Most people are way too kind to their grapes, or not kind at all, and don't prune enough. They need to take out a lot more.
Okay. Question here is from Sioux Falls. Can you tell me what time of the moon, phases of the moon, I'm sure they're referring to plant my garden, or don't you feel that's really a reliable, or is it too old traditional to follow the moon in planting the garden?
Well, I'd say it'd be more important to follow the weather and see what's happening with the temperatures and the soil temperature and moisture conditions, especially with our clay soils around here. If you're out there because it's the right phase of the moon, but the soil is too wet to work, I'd say you're probably going to have poorer results than if you waited for the soil to dry out a few days and do it when the time is right there. So I've read about some of those traditions and things, but personally I don't have a lot of faith in them.
More on growing conditions.
I think that's more important.
This is from Brookings. I currently have a young accolade elm wrapped with black fabric, and there's a secondary chicken wire mesh circling about 3 to 4 inches away from the trunk. And the cottontails took out a tree similar to this last year, girdled it. There are buds starting to show on the branches, but they're still rather small. When should I unwrap that tree, and should I replace the chicken wire back around that to discourage the cottontails later on? So that's kind of a tricky time of the year if you take it off too early or late, isn't it?
The good thing is that even though it's been slow, there are food plants out there for the cottontails. The grasses are starting to come up and green out. There's other material for them to eat, so hopefully they'll let your trees alone. But to be on the safe side, I would say you might want to replace that chicken wire, but I would take off the other wrap around the trees. If you got wrap on your trees yet from over the winter time, take that off. And if you want to be safe, leave some chicken wire around them. It's certainly not going to hurt anything as long as you've got it far enough away from the trunk so you're not going to be girdling the stem. One of the problems I have with some of my young trees at home is the cats like to use them as a scratching post, and that can be pretty damaging to the trees too. So a little chicken wire there can also help.
All right. From Sioux Falls also, Larry perhaps, or Dave, either one on this one. They replaced the sewer. There's mushrooms growing on the disturbed soil. No lawn is growing there. What can they do to get rid of the mushrooms to reestablish a lawn or do something to the topsoil? Very shaded, of course, because of the tree. And they tried to get on guard line last year, but they couldn't get their question through. So they're bringing it on first thing this year.
Well, it sounds like you've got plenty of nutrients there. If the mushrooms are growing, there's probably some organic matter, some old roots or old wood, or even some leaf litter that's decomposing, and that's what the mushrooms are growing on. I get this question a lot. What can we do to get rid of the mushrooms? Well, the best answer is actually just to keep picking those mushrooms. As the moisture goes away, so too will the fruiting bodies of those mushrooms, but there's really nothing good to recommend that you put on the soil. I don't think soil fungicides, soil-applied granular fungicides, is a wise thing to use. It's actually an off-label use anyway. They're not going to be very effective, longer than about a week anyway, so not going to be very good at controlling the mushrooms. If you have the situation where you have some roots and things like that, you can actually get that wood out of the system. If you have wood chips or something like that in the ground, get that out of the system. But if it's just growing on organic matter that's well composted, not much to do, and that's a good thing for you, really. What you're battling now is more of a shade problem, shade-tolerant species, some ground covers that are going to be useful in that respect. But getting your Kentucky bluegrass to grow back there is probably not realistic.
All right. Hudson, South Dakota. Mike, Creeping Charlie or Creeping Jenny is in an established lawn. The lawn receives sunlight. What is the best method in order to control the weed or get rid of it? The person would prefer not to use toxic chemicals if possible.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, and Creeping Charlie is one that you'll see greening up now. It's a perennial, and so that'll be one of the first weeds in your yard showing up. You know, it's a tough perennial. It creeps kind of like a strawberry, kind of above the ground, so you could rake it, that sort of thing. There's been some people that have used borax to control it, but then you might run the risk of killing your lawn. So there's really not a good, you know, non-chemical approach. Just I'd say rake it and remove as much of it as you can. Maybe try to get some more shade-tolerant grasses or maybe other landscape plants in the area, because usually it thrives in those areas, kind of like the mushrooms that Larry was talking about, where shade is declining your lawn as well. And so that's kind of where we're at, or you know, physically removing it to the best you can.
Okay.
Not an easy job.
The Creeping Charlie, would that be the borax?
Yeah, that has been talked about, but you know, it's a foliar thing, and we're talking about a perennial, and so you know, it would be a thing where you're mainly defoliating it, and you'd have to do that for several years. So pretty tough way to go.
All right, 2 questions here. Yankton and Slayton, Minnesota, both very similar, and I think John, you took these last year. Yellow spots in the lawn, they believe it's night crawlers. Is there any legal pesticide to apply? The other one is, what do I do about night crawlers in my yard? So,
yeah, well, I'm not sure that the yellow spots in the lawn are necessarily going to be night crawlers. I would guess that you have something else going on there. Just finding a yellow spot, it could be any number of things, but night crawlers won't typically do that. They leave some pretty big castings at this time of year. You'll see it as the snow melts, and some people complain about those. They leave those lumps. As far as getting rid of them, you know, we don't have great insecticides that are labeled against them. A lot of people find that if you keep that thatch off of the grass as best as possible, and you just try to limit some of the nutrients that they would be using in the soil, you can cut down on numbers of them. At the same time, you know, all of those earthworms are introduced here. We don't have native earthworms in this part of the world, so if you choose to get rid of them, you know, you're not necessarily going to hurt that much out there. One of the people last year did suggest find some fishermen and invite them over and have them take all those night crawlers out of there.
all right. We got 2 questions here, Mike. They're kind of similar, different plants from the Springs area, Wessington Springs and Valley Springs. The first one deals with hibiscus plants, not showing any growth. Wants to know if she can use Roundup over the plant. Grass is growing up through them right now, but the hibiscus are not up. Would like an answer tonight, if at all possible, to this question.
Well, I can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, any of your perennials, as long as they're not up yet, you could use Roundup, and it's not going to get in the soil and it won't hurt them. So yeah, now is a good time to control these things. Even that asparagus situation we talked about earlier, if you're starting to see those perennial grasses like smooth brome starting to pop up right now, now would be a great time to control them with a glyphosate product. So yep, as long as they're not coming up though. If they're coming up, you're going to be in big trouble.
Okay. The other one from Valley Springs is asparagus raspberries. Can I use a propane torch to scorch the grass before the asparagus or raspberries come out?
Yeah, unfortunately not. Those perennials are coming from the roots, and so you'll burn the tops off, and so that won't work. But for the annuals that come up a little bit later, you bet. Nice way to control some of those annual weeds, grasses, and broadleaves. Got to get them while they're small. But yeah, nice non-chemical way to control some of those things.
If nothing else, we might warm the ground up and get those raspberries and asparagus
you bet.
rolling. So.
Lots of uses. Torch those little tent caterpillars and everything with it.
Yeah. Watertown, garter snakes around their house. They want to know how to get rid of them. In fact, we even have a nice little snake drawing there on the sheet. And they want to get rid of me. So.
Yeah, you know, that's another tricky one. I know we had Casey Jensen on last year, and he talked a couple times about trying to get rid of these things. Best bet there is going to be trying to limit hiding places for them and the food that they eat. And around houses, that means a lot of the landscaping that we find attractive is also attractive to them as a place to live. May mean removing some of those shrubs, or at least getting them far enough away from the foundation that you have a space there and can keep some of those snakes away from the foundation. Also removing food sources, and food sources would be any of those insects or other small creatures that would be living in those same areas. You make it favorable for those things, it's going to be great places for snakes, and then once they're there, you know, they're harmless enough around a house, but a lot of people don't care for them there, and the best way to get rid of them is going to be trying to work on those longer term things like that.
All right. Kimball Dave, when is the best time to transplant daffodils and tulips?
Best time is actually after the foliage has died down, and right now people say, oh, it's time I can transplant them around while they're in bloom. You want to wait till after they're done blooming, and then wait till after that foliage has turned yellow and dried down. So you have to probably stick a stake or something where those bulbs are, and then dig them up in like August or September and move them then. If you disturb that growing cycle now, you're going to probably set them back for at least a year, so you aren't going to have any bloom probably next year, a very limited bloom next year. So wait until they go dormant, then you can dig them up and transplant them and put them in their new location or divide them up a little bit.
Okay, going back to Wessington near Wolseley, Black Hills spruce is what they're talking about here. 4 to 5 feet tall, the rabbits ate nearly all of the lower branches. Main branch is left. They ring the trees half to 2/3 of the way to the top. Had some mean snow drifts this year, so the rabbits could get up there a little bit higher. Should I cut the trees out, or what they're asking here? Or can you answer that one, or you need more information? Or
well, some pictures would help us in a situation like that, but the rabbits are going to go after those Black Hill spruce when they get kind of desperate, don't have anything else to eat. Ordinarily aren't going to bother them too much, but if you've still got some good branches up at the top, it's certainly going to set the trees back for a few years, but hopefully there's going to be enough growth there to get some new growth coming out in the next few years and get those plants kind of back on track again. I wouldn't be in too big of a hurry to cut off those lower branches. If they can leaf out a little bit, that's going to still help that plant somewhat, unless they're just so darn ugly that you can't stand to look at them. Take those branches off if you have to, but leave them if you can, and just give them a few more years and see what they look like. If this is a show place, though, where those have to look good, all you can really do is just probably replace them and try to do some big, tall fencing or something around them in future years to avoid getting those rabbits in. Those rabbits are tenacious. When they get hungry, they will find a way through if they can.
Okay. Winter. We have an Austrian pine that appears to be infested with borers of some type. What can we do for this? There are small round holes, needles that have died, as well as areas where sap is oozing out. It does appear that woodpeckers have been working on the tree also. The natural predators are the natural predators we can buy, or traps that we can put in the tree to help, or should we use pesticides? So you might have a couple things going on there the way it sounds.
Yeah, I think we do. I think the needles are actually probably going to be the easiest one to address, and I think Dave probably talked a little bit about that earlier with some of the trees. It's just hard winter on some of those evergreens, and I think that's probably why we're seeing the needles going on. As far as the borers go on there, you know, I'd like to see some pictures of this one. I'm not sure exactly what type of borer might be most likely to be affecting it. My first suspicion on this one from the report that came in on this is actually that it may be a sapsucker that's going to work on this tree. They'll come in and affect Austrian pine, Scotch pine, and some of those in the spring as they're migrating through. They drill a series of holes, just tiny little holes, and they look like borer holes, but they line them up and they go along in that line and they put those holes in there, and then as the sap oozes out, they return and literally suck the sap out of those holes. That's how they feed, and usually doesn't do a lot of damage to the tree. Just has that pattern on there like that, and I would guess that might be what's going on, but if we could see pictures on that, it would definitely help.
Okay.
Where was that?
Dave, you got something?
So go ahead.
I was going to suggest if they've got pitch masses kind of coming out of the tree around where the branches are attached, maybe some branches breaking out, it could be Zimmerman pine moth, which is pretty common on Austrian, and actually now is a time to do some treatment for those, now and again in August, I believe. But a permethrin spray, I think, is the best one that's recommended there, but just coat that area of the trunk and watch, check those pitch masses. If you see those reddish pitch matches coming out and branches kind of breaking out of there, that's probably what you're dealing with.
Okay. Two different sort of...
Well, and I agree with the sapsucker idea. I think that's probably what's causing the holes. If they're just holes all kind of lined up in a row, that's probably the sapsucker, which looks bad, but usually doesn't cause a whole lot of damage.
And the sapsucker is a woodpecker species, so they are protected. So
right, they're a migratory bird. You can't do much to them except maybe try to discourage them a little bit.
Okay. Quick answer to this one, Dave, if you can. They power rake their lawn. Is it too early to aerate, or should they wait till next year?
I'd go ahead and aerate if they have the information or have the material to do that. It might be a little wet. Wait until that soil dries out a little bit.
Rapid City. where they're at.
But
So.
yeah, they probably have a little drier conditions out there, but spring is a good time to aerate, and again in the fall is another good time to aerate too.
Okay. Power raking or not?
Power raking, you can do that in the spring or in the fall. You want to do it when it's cool, though. For cool season grasses, they have a chance to recover, so now isn't a bad time to do it. But of the two, probably core aeration is a better practice to do than the power raking.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that. So, and that's all the time we have this evening. So just to let you know, Garden Line does repeat twice each week on South Dakota Public Broadcasting Digital Channel 3, also known as the Create Channel. The encore broadcast can be seen Thursdays at 11 a.m. Central and Saturdays at 4 p.m. Central. Check your local listings to find SDPB Digital Channel 3 where you live. Now time to wrap up, and thanks to our panel of experts, John Keycafer, Brookings County Extension Educator, David Graper, SDSU Horticulture Department Head and Extension Horticulturalist, Larry Osborne, Extension Plant Pathologist, and Mike Meckning, Extension Weed Specialist. Thanks to our phone volunteers, the folks from the SDSU Plant Science Graduate Student Association, and thanks to you for watching and calling in. On behalf of the entire crew, have a good evening and happy gardening.
Funding for Garden Line is provided in part by your membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. And by Swiftel Communications.